Katie Grace Morrison loved butterflies. She would chase them through her grandmother's garden in the small town of Ashland, Wisconsin, her tiny hands reaching up toward wings she could never quite catch, laughing that pure, unself-conscious laugh that only 3-year-olds possess. In August 1987, the child disappeared from her family's front yard while her mother, Lynn, carried groceries from the car. She left behind a red plastic bucket, a half-eaten popsicle melting on the sidewalk, and a family whose hearts would beat differently, slower, heavier, for the rest of their lives. For 36 years, Lynn kept Katie's room exactly as it was, the butterfly mobile still hanging above the toddler bed, the worn copy of The Very Hungry Caterpillar on the nightstand, a purple dress laid out for a first day of preschool that never came. Then, in 2023, a detective named Michael Torres, who understood what it meant to live with impossible questions, pulled a storage box from the basement of the Ashland County Sheriff's Department. DNA technology that didn't exist in 1987 finally gave Katie's silence a voice. What the family would learn about someone who had stood among them during those desperate search parties, someone who had hugged Lynn and promised to help find her baby, would shatter them in ways they didn't know they could still break. This is a story about how hope can calcify into something sharp and painful, about families who learn to breathe around absence, and about the people who refuse to let forgotten children stay forgotten. It's about mothers who count years in missed birthdays, about siblings who grow up as only children, and about how sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the truth arrives not as relief, but as a door finally closing after decades of standing open. Falling in love with Katie. Katie Grace Morrison came into the world on a February morning in 1984, 3 weeks early and already impatient to start living. Her mother, Lynn, would later say that Katie never walked when she could run, never whispered when she could shout, never sat still when the whole world was waiting to be explored. She was fire and motion and joy, wrapped in 30 pounds of golden curls and grass-stained knees. Lynn and David Morrison were high school sweethearts who'd married young. Too young, people said, though they proved the doubters wrong. David worked at the paper mill on the edge of town, coming home with ink on his hands and stories about the machines for Katie, who listened with rapt attention even though she understood maybe 1 word in 10. Lynn worked part-time at the town library, a job that let her bring Katie along, where the toddler would read to herself in the children's section, holding books upside down and making up elaborate stories based entirely on the pictures. Their older daughter, Rebecca, was 7 when Katie was born, and the age gap could have created distance, but instead, it created devotion. Rebecca took her role as big sister with breathtaking seriousness. She taught Katie to blow dandelion seeds and make wishes, to find shapes in clouds, to say please and thank you in a tiny, serious voice that made adults smile. On the day Katie disappeared, Rebecca was at summer camp, learning to swim and weave friendship bracelets, innocent of the fact that her world was ending. The Morrison family lived on Maple Street, a quiet residential road where kids still played outside until dinner and neighbors knew each other's names. Their house was a modest 2-story with peeling yellow paint that David kept meaning to fix, a front porch with a swing, and that garden, Lynn's mother's garden really, since they lived in the house Lynn had grown up in. Grandma Helen had passed away the previous spring, and Lynn tended the flowers now, sometimes with tears running down her face as she pulled weeds, teaching Katie the names of flowers she'd learned from her own mother. Petunias, marigolds, black-eyed Susans. Katie repeated them like prayers, stumbling over the syllables. She particularly loved the monarch butterflies that visited the milkweed, and she would stand very still, or as still as a 3-year-old could manage, watching them with wonder that made Lynn's throat tight. Her mother had loved butterflies too. August 14th, 1987, was a Friday. Lynn remembered it was unusually hot for northern Wisconsin, the kind of thick, humid heat that made everything feel sluggish. She'd taken Katie to the library that morning for story time, the rainbow fish, Katie's favorite, and then to the grocery store. Katie had been good, mostly, though she'd tried to sneak a candy bar into the cart and had pitched a brief fit when Lynn said no. In the parking lot, Lynn had relented and bought her daughter a cherry popsicle from the ice cream truck, and Katie's forgiveness had been immediate and complete, as only a 3-year-old's can be. They arrived home around 3:30 p.m. Lynn's arms were full of grocery bags, and Katie was clutching her popsicle, red juice already running down her chin and arm. "Let Mommy put the bags down, and then we'll clean you up," Lynn said, unlocking the front door. Here's where the narrative would fracture, where Lynn's memory would become unreliable, eroded by decades of police questions and her own recursive guilt. She thought, she believed, she remembered telling Katie to stay in the yard, to play with her bucket and shovel while Mommy got the cold things into the refrigerator. She thought Katie had nodded, had said, "Okay, Mommy," in that sweet, obedient voice she used when she wanted to be praised. But trauma does strange things to memory. Police would later note small inconsistencies in Lynn's recollections. Had she told Katie to stay in the yard, or had she just assumed Katie would? Had she left the front door open or closed it? Had she heard any sounds from outside while she was putting away groceries? A car door, voices, Katie's laughter? I don't know. Lynn would sob to the police, to the reporters, to herself in the mirror at 3 a.m. I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. What was certain? Lynn carried in 4 bags of groceries. She put the milk and eggs in the refrigerator, the bread on the counter. The whole process took maybe 5 minutes, possibly 7. When she walked back outside to get Katie and bring her in for hand washing and nap time, the front yard was empty. The red bucket sat on the grass, overturned. The popsicle stick lay on the sidewalk, ants already gathering at the sticky residue. Katie was gone. Lynn called her daughter's name, voice still light, still assuming this was a game. Katie loved hide and seek, though at 3 she was terrible at it, always giggling and giving herself away. Katie? Katie, honey, where are you? Come out, wherever you are. She checked behind the bushes, behind the car, on the porch. Her voice got louder, sharper. Katie Grace Morrison, this isn't funny. Come here right now. She ran into the house, through every room, throwing open closets, looking under beds. The bathroom, the basement, back outside, the garage, the backyard. Katie! Panic was setting in now, making her movements jerky, uncoordinated. She ran to the neighbor's house, pounding on the door. Martha Henderson opened it, flour on her hands from baking, her smile fading as she saw Lynn's face. Have you seen Katie? I can't find Katie. Martha hadn't seen her. She wiped her hands and came out, calling for her teenage son, Josh. They spread out, checking their yard, looking up and down the street. Other neighbors emerged, drawn by the commotion. Everyone began searching, under porches, in sheds, behind garbage cans. Someone called the police. Lynn didn't remember who. Everything was fragmenting, time turning strange and elastic. A police car arrived, Officer Tom Bradley, who'd gone to school with Lynn, who knew Katie, who looked grim as he asked his questions. How long has she been missing? Lynn looked at her watch. It was 4:15 p.m. 45 minutes? An hour? I don't know. It's okay, Lynn. It's okay. Let's get more people out here looking. But it wasn't okay. It would never be okay again. David got the call at work and left immediately, driving home with his heart in his throat, praying to a God he'd never fully believed in. Please, please let her have just wandered off. Please let her be at a neighbor's house. Please let this be a story we'll laugh about later, about the time Katie scared us all to death. He pulled up to find his street full of police cars, neighbors, people he'd never seen before who'd heard about the missing child and come to help. Lynn ran to him, and he caught her, and they held each other as she sobbed. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I only looked away for a minute. It's not your fault, he told her. The first of 1,000 times he would say those words, trying to make them true through repetition. It's not your fault. The Ashland Police Department mobilized everything they had. Chief Robert Hansen, a gruff man with 2 daughters of his own, organized search parties. Volunteers walked through the woods behind the neighborhood, calling Katie's name until their voices gave out. They searched the shores of Lake Superior, though Katie was afraid of water and wouldn't have gone near it on her own. They went door to door, asking if anyone had seen anything, heard anything. The local news ran Katie's picture, the most recent one, from her 3rd birthday party 2 months earlier, where she was wearing a yellow dress and had frosting on her nose, grinning at the camera with pure, unself-conscious joy. That photo would become iconic in the region, plastered on telephone poles and in shop windows, printed on flyers that would yellow and fade over the years. Missing, Katie Grace Morrison, age 3. Last seen wearing pink shorts, white t-shirt with a rainbow on it, white sandals, blonde curly hair, blue eyes, approximately 36 inches tall, 30 pounds. If you have any information, please contact the Ashland Police Department. The FBI arrived on day 2, as they always did with missing children. Special Agent Linda Crawford became the face of the federal investigation, and Lynn would remember her for the rest of her life. The way she looked Lynn in the eye when she spoke, the way she never made promises she couldn't keep, the way she said, "When we find Katie," instead of "if." But the leads that poured in went nowhere. Someone thought they saw a little girl matching Katie's description at a rest stop near Duluth. It was a different child, visiting from Minneapolis. Someone else reported seeing a man putting a crying toddler into a van. The man was a divorced father picking up his own daughter for his custody weekend. A psychic called claiming Katie was near water, underground. They searched every well and cistern in the county and found nothing. On day 3, they brought in search dogs. Lynn had to give them something with Katie's scent. She chose the purple stuffed bunny that Katie slept with every night, the one that smelled like baby shampoo and something indefinably Katie. She watched the dogs nose the bunny, then set off, and she wanted to follow. But the police wouldn't let her, said she needed to stay by the phone in case there was a ransom call. There was never a ransom call. The dogs tracked Katie's scent from the front yard to the street, where it vanished. That meant a car, probably. That meant someone had taken her. That meant Lynn's worst nightmare was true. On day 4, Rebecca came home from camp early, driven by a counselor who cried the whole way. She walked into a house that felt wrong, full of police and strangers and her parents who looked like hollowed-out versions of themselves. She asked where Katie was, and Lynn couldn't answer, could only pull Rebecca close and hold her while they both wept. "I want my sister back," Rebecca sobbed. "I want Katie back." They all did. They all did. The investigation was intensive, as investigations into missing children always are in those crucial first days. Police interviewed everyone on Maple Street, Everyone who'd been at the grocery store that day, everyone who'd attended library story time. They looked at registered sex offenders in the area. There were 3, and all had alibis. They examined Lynn and David's lives for anything suspicious: debts, affairs, enemies. They found nothing. The hardest interviews were with the family themselves. Police had to rule out the parents, as they always must, though it was clear to everyone that Lynn and David had nothing to do with Katie's disappearance. Still, they were asked about their marriage, their finances, whether they'd ever harmed Katie, whether they knew anyone who would want to hurt their family. They were given polygraphs, which they passed. The questions they asked Rebecca were gentler, but no less painful. Did Katie ever talk about any adults who made her uncomfortable? Did anyone ever tell Katie to keep secrets? Had Rebecca noticed anyone watching the house, hanging around the neighborhood? No. 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 On day 7, the FBI brought in a criminal profiler. He theorized that Katie had been taken by an opportunistic predator who saw a chance and took it. Someone driving by who saw a small child alone and acted on impulse. He said that statistically, if Katie wasn't found in the first 48 hours, the likelihood of finding her alive dropped dramatically. Lynn stopped eating. David stopped sleeping. Rebecca started wetting the bed again, something she hadn't done since she was 5. Their family was falling apart, and Katie was somewhere unknown, with someone unknown, and the not knowing was a special kind of torture. The media coverage was intense in those first weeks. News crews camped out on Maple Street. Lynn and David did interviews, pleading for Katie's return, for information, for mercy from whoever had taken their daughter. Lynn held up Katie's butterfly mobile, her voice breaking as she said, "She loves butterflies. She's just a baby. Please, if you have her, please bring her home. We won't be angry. We just want our little girl back." The town rallied. They held candlelight vigils. They raised money for a reward fund. They printed thousands of flyers. Katie's face was everywhere, and yet she was nowhere. As weeks became months, the searchers dwindled. Police presence decreased. The reporters moved on to other stories. The maple leaves turned red and gold and fell. Winter came hard and early, snow covering the ground where Katie had last stood. Life went on, as it cruelly does, and the Morrison family learned to exist in a state of suspended animation, not moving forward, not moving back, just surviving. Lynn went back to work at the library because they needed the income, and because staying home in that house, with Katie's toys still scattered across the living room floor, was unbearable. But she couldn't concentrate, couldn't remember which books went where. Found herself crying in the children's section when she saw The Very Hungry Caterpillar. David threw himself into overtime at the mill, working double shifts, exhausting himself so he could sleep without dreaming of his missing daughter. His co-workers were kind, then awkward, then gave up trying to comfort him and left him alone with his silence. Rebecca started 4th grade that fall, walking into a classroom where everyone knew her as the girl whose little sister was missing. Teachers treated her with exaggerated gentleness. Other kids either avoided her or pestered her with questions. She learned to keep her head down, to make herself invisible, to pretend everything was fine. The family stopped doing things they used to do. No more family game nights. No more Sunday dinners with Lynn's father and stepmother. No more Christmas decorations. The thought of hanging stockings when Katie wasn't there was unbearable. Their house became a mausoleum of grief, every room echoing with what was missing. Years passed. Katie would have turned 4, 5, 6. The age progression photos the FBI created showed what she might look like as she grew, but they felt wrong, disconnected from the curly-haired toddler Lynn remembered. On Katie's 9th birthday, Lynn baked a cake anyway, lit 3 candles. Katie would always be 3 in her memory. And then threw the whole thing in the garbage and sobbed on the kitchen floor until David found her. He sat down beside her without a word, and they leaned against the kitchen cabinets together, surrounded by the detritus of abandoned celebration. David picked frosting off the floor where the cake had splattered, and absurdly, he tasted it. Chocolate, Katie's favorite. "Remember her birthday party?" he said. "The 3rd one. She got frosting everywhere. In her hair, on her dress, on the dog." They didn't have a dog, but Lynn understood he was remembering the neighbor's golden retriever that had wandered into the yard and gotten into the cake before anyone noticed. Katie had thought it was hilarious, had laughed until she couldn't breathe. "She had the best laugh," Lynn whispered. "She had your laugh," David said. "Still does when I hear it in my memory." These were the moments that sustained them. Not the big, dramatic expressions of grief, but these quiet acknowledgments that Katie had existed, that she'd been real, that her 3 years on Earth had mattered. They learned to carry her with them this way, in small moments of remembering. There were other missing children in those years, other families joining the terrible club that Lynn and David now belonged to. They attended support groups at first, sitting in church basements with other parents whose eyes held the same haunted look. Some of them found their children, alive, dead. It almost didn't matter. At least they knew. But most, like the Morrisons, lived in limbo, waiting for answers that never came. Lynn met a woman named Patricia, whose son had disappeared in 1989, also 3 years old. They understood each other in a way no one else could, spoke a language of grief that needed no translation. They'd meet for coffee once a month, and sometimes they'd talk about their missing children, and sometimes they'd talk about anything else. Books, weather, trivial things that felt both inappropriate and necessary. "Do you think we'll ever know?" Patricia asked once, stirring her coffee though she took it black. "I don't know," Lynn admitted. "Some days I think I'd rather live with hope than die with certainty. If I knew for sure Katie was dead, what would I have left?" "Peace," Patricia suggested. "Maybe. Or maybe just a different kind of torment." Patricia's son was found in 1997, remains discovered by hikers in a state park. The killer was never identified. Patricia called Lynn the day the news broke, and they cried together over the phone, grieving not just for Patricia's loss, but for the future Lynn could now clearly see, one where finding Katie might mean burying her. Detective Bradley never forgot about Katie, even as he rose through the ranks, eventually becoming chief of police when Hansen retired. He kept Katie's case file on his desk. He reviewed it periodically, looking for something everyone had missed. He sent evidence to the FBI for analysis as new technologies emerged. But there was so little evidence to work with. No witnesses, no forensics, no nothing. Just an empty yard and a melted popsicle. By the time Katie would have been a teenager, most people in Ashland had moved on, though they still remembered. The anniversary of her disappearance was marked in the local paper each year. New residents moving to Maple Street would hear about the little girl who'd vanished from number 423, and some would cross themselves, some would install security systems, some would think it couldn't happen to them. Lynn and David's marriage survived, though barely. They went to counseling. They had screaming fights about nothing and everything. They learned each other's grief patterns, when to push, when to give space. They stayed together, not because they were happy, but because they were bound by shared trauma, by Katie's absence, by the fact that no one else could understand. Rebecca grew up in therapy, working through survivor's guilt, and the feeling that she'd lost not just her sister, but her parents too, even though they were right there. She became quiet, cautious, careful. She went to college, became a social worker, chose a profession where she could help people because she couldn't help Katie. She never mentioned having a sister unless directly asked, and when she did, people never knew what to say. Lynn stopped keeping Katie's room unchanged after 15 years. Rebecca needed the space for her own growing up, and finally Lynn acknowledged that Katie wouldn't come home to sleep in a toddler bed, wouldn't need 3-year-old clothes. She packed everything carefully, the clothes, the toys, the butterfly mobile, and put the boxes in the attic, where they gathered dust and held vigil alone. But some things she kept: Katie's blanket, the worn copy of The Very Hungry Caterpillar, a drawing Katie had made at library story time, crayon scribbles that might have been butterflies or might have been nothing. But Lynn had saved it, had taped it to the refrigerator, and it stayed there for 36 years, fading to ghostly pale colors, but still present, still testimony that Katie had existed. The Alchemy of Hope. Detective Michael Torres was 7 years old in 1987, growing up in El Paso, Texas, building forts and playing baseball, and not yet aware that the world contained tragedies like missing children. He became a cop at 23, young and idealistic, believing he could make a difference, believing in justice. His first case as a homicide detective broke him a little. A 12-year-old girl murdered by her stepfather. Michael sat in his car after the arrest and wept, and his partner, an older detective named Sam Rodriguez, let him cry and then said, "You can't do this job if you let it destroy you, but you can't do it right if you don't let it touch you. Find the balance." Michael never quite found the balance. He took cases home with him, both literally and figuratively. His wife, Elena, understood because she was a nurse and took her work home too, but it strained their marriage. They had 2 daughters, and Michael was overprotective, terrified of the monsters he knew existed because he arrested them. When he was 35, his youngest daughter, Sophia, was diagnosed with leukemia. The next 2 years were hospital rooms and chemo and praying and bargaining with God. Sophia survived. She's 23 now, healthy, studying marine biology. But the experience changed Michael. He understood, in a way he never had before, what it meant to watch your child suffer and be helpless to stop it. After Sophia's recovery, Michael transferred to the cold case unit. His colleagues thought it was strange. Cold cases were usually where older detectives went to wind down their careers, not where ambitious 40-year-olds went. But Michael explained it simply. Someone's still waiting for these answers. Someone's mother is still hoping. I want to give them what I'd have wanted if we'd lost Sophia, the truth. In 2022, Michael and Elena moved to northern Wisconsin for her job, a position at the University of Wisconsin hospital system that she'd always wanted. Michael got a job with the Wisconsin Department of Justice's cold case unit, working out of Madison but covering unsolved cases across the state. That's how he found Katie Morrison. He was reviewing old cases from Ashland County, looking for ones that might benefit from modern DNA analysis. There weren't many. Small, rural counties don't generate a lot of cold cases, thankfully. But Katie's file called to him. Maybe it was because Sophia was 3 when she got sick, and he remembered how small 3 was, how vulnerable. Maybe it was the photo of Katie with frosting on her nose, grinning like the world was full of wonderful things. Maybe it was the notes from Detective Bradley, who'd written in the margin, "I think about this little girl every day. Someone knows something." Michael requested all the physical evidence from storage. There wasn't much. Katie's case hadn't generated a lot of physical evidence because she'd simply vanished. But there were items collected during the initial investigation. The popsicle stick, though any DNA would long since have degraded. Samples taken from the front yard, though they'd revealed nothing useful in 1987. And one item that caught Michael's attention. In the initial interviews, several neighbors mentioned seeing a blue pickup truck driving slowly down Maple Street around the time of Katie's disappearance. Multiple witnesses, consistent descriptions. Police at the time had investigated. Blue pickups were common in Wisconsin, and they couldn't track down everyone. But the notes mentioned they'd recovered a partial muddy footprint from the Morrisons' yard that didn't match any family member or known visitor. That footprint had been photographed and preserved, and a casting had been made. In 1987, footprints were analyzed manually, compared visually. In 2023, computer databases could compare footprint patterns against millions of shoe treads, identify make and model. Michael sent the casting to the FBI's forensics lab. 3 weeks later, he got a call. The print matched a specific work boot, Red Wing Style 2406, a steel-toed boot popular with construction workers and manual laborers. The wear pattern suggested someone who walked with a slight outward cant of the right foot, approximately 180-200 pounds. It wasn't much, but it was something. Michael pulled all the interviews from 1987, looking for anyone who fit that profile. Several men did. It was a working-class town. Lots of people wore work boots. But one name kept appearing in multiple interviews. Donald Vickers, a contractor who'd done some repair work for families in the neighborhood. Michael sat up straighter. He pulled Vickers' interview from the file. The man had been questioned early in the investigation because he'd been at the Henderson house 2 doors down from the Morrisons that day, fixing a leaky roof. He'd stayed late because he wanted to finish the job, and he'd driven away around 5 p.m. after Katie had already been reported missing. In his interview, Vickers had been cooperative, concerned, helpful. "Terrible thing," he'd said. "I've got grandkids myself. Can't imagine." He'd offered to help search, had joined the volunteer efforts over the following days. Police had cleared him. No criminal record, no red flags, an alibi for the critical time period since he'd been on the Henderson roof where multiple people could vouch for him, except Michael noticed something odd. According to the police timeline, Katie was last seen around 3:30 p.m. The alarm was raised by 4:15 p.m. But Vickers said in his interview he'd been on the roof from 2 p.m. until 5 p.m., taking no breaks except one quick trip to his truck for a tool around 3 p.m. Michael pulled property records. Donald Vickers had lived in Ashland in 1987 at an address on the outskirts of town. He'd moved to Minnesota in 1989. Michael ran his current information. Vickers was now 74, living in a small town near Duluth. He was a widower, his wife having passed away in 2018. He had 3 adult children, none of whom lived near him. Michael ran Vickers' name through every database he had access to. No criminal record as an adult, though there was a juvenile record that had been sealed, and Michael had to get a court order to unseal it. When he did, his stomach dropped. In 1965, when Donald Vickers was 17, he'd been arrested for voyeurism, peeping in windows of homes in his neighborhood in Duluth. He'd been caught, charged as a juvenile, sent to counseling. The record had been sealed when he turned 21, standard procedure. It would never have shown up in the 1987 investigation. One incident of voyeurism at 17 didn't make someone a child abductor decades later. Michael knew that. But something nagged at him. He reviewed Vickers' statement again. The man had said he'd helped search for Katie, had been one of the regular volunteers in the days after her disappearance. He'd been interviewed multiple times, always cooperative, always concerned. Michael knew from years of experience that sometimes perpetrators inserted themselves into investigations. They wanted to watch the chaos they'd created, wanted to feel the power, wanted to help solve the crime they'd committed. Michael drove to Ashland. He needed to walk where Katie had walked, see what she'd seen. He stood in the Morrisons' front yard. They didn't live there anymore, hadn't for years, but the current owners let him look around. From the yard, he could see the Henderson house. The angle was right. Someone on the roof working could absolutely see into the Morrison yard, could see a little girl playing alone. He drove to the Minnesota town where Donald Vickers lived now, a place called Moose Lake, population 2,700. Vickers lived in a small house on the edge of town, well-maintained, unremarkable. Michael didn't approach yet. He needed more before he could interview Vickers, needed something solid. He requested Vickers' phone records from 1987, but phone records from that era were long gone. He tracked down Vickers' ex-wife. They'd divorced in 2001. She'd remarried and moved to Florida. Michael called her, identified himself, asked if she'd answer some questions about her former husband. "Donnie?" She sounded surprised. "What's he done?" "I'm looking into an old case. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions about him?" "Sure, I guess. We're not in touch anymore. Haven't been for years. What do you want to know?" "When you were married, did he ever behave inappropriately around children?" There was a long pause. "What kind of question is that?" "I know it's uncomfortable, but it's important." Another pause. Then, "Look, Donnie wasn't a bad person, but he always made me a little nervous around kids. Nothing I could put my finger on, just a feeling. He'd watch children at the park a little too long. He'd volunteer to coach Little League, but I told him no. When our grandkids were born, I never left him alone with them. Just gut feeling, you know?" Michael's pulse quickened. "Did you ever discuss this with him?" "Once. He got mad, said I was crazy, said he just liked kids. But the way he said it..." She trailed off. "Why are you asking about this? Did he do something?" "I can't discuss details of an open investigation, but thank you for your honesty." After he hung up, Michael sat in his car for a long time, thinking. It still wasn't enough for charges. A sealed juvenile record and an ex-wife's gut feeling wouldn't convince any prosecutor. He needed something concrete. He went back through Katie's case file, reading every interview, every tip that had come in. And then he found it, buried in a supplemental report from a neighbor named Joyce Patterson, who lived 4 houses down from the Morrisons. Patterson had called police on day 6 of the investigation to report that she'd seen Donald Vickers' blue pickup truck parked on their street on several occasions before Katie's disappearance, not just the day he was working on the Henderson roof, but earlier too. She'd noticed because it was unusual. Vickers didn't live on their street, and there weren't any other houses needing repairs at that time. The police had noted the tip, but apparently never followed up because Vickers had already been cleared based on his alibi. Michael tracked down Joyce Patterson. She was 86 now, living in an assisted living facility in Ashland. He visited her, brought flowers, asked if she remembered Katie Morrison. "Of course I remember," she said, her eyes suddenly sharp despite her age. "That poor baby. I think about her every time I drive past that house." "You called police with a tip during the investigation. Do you remember that?" "I told them about that truck. Blue Chevy, older model. I saw it several times in the weeks before Katie disappeared, driving slow, parking for a while. It made me uncomfortable, so I wrote down the license plate number once. I gave it to the police." Michael felt electricity run through him. "You wrote down the plate number?" "I did. I was a teacher for 40 years, Detective. I always carried a little notebook. Do you know if they ever followed up on it? Michael looked through the file again. If Patterson had given police a plate number, it should have been in the report. But it wasn't. Either it had been lost in the chaos of the investigation, or it had been noted somewhere else and misfiled. Do you still have your notebooks from 1987? Patterson smiled. I keep everything. My daughter's always trying to get me to throw things away, but I'm sentimental. I've got boxes of old notebooks in storage. Give me a few days and I'll look. 3 days later, Michael got a call. Patterson had found her 1987 notebooks. In one, dated July 29th, 1987, 2 weeks before Katie's disappearance, she'd written, "Blue truck again. Driving slow past houses. Plate, DJV 437. Michael ran the plate. It had been registered to Donald James Vickers. Now he had something. Not proof of abduction, but proof that Vickers had been in the neighborhood before Katie disappeared, that his presence was concerning enough for a neighbor to document it. Combined with the boot print, the timeline, the ex-wife's concerns, Michael had enough to move forward. He consulted with the district attorney's office. They agreed he had enough for a search warrant of Vickers' current residence and to request DNA samples. But they warned him. 36 years was a long time. Memory fades, evidence degrades. Even if they found something, building a prosecutable case would be difficult. I have to try, Michael said. Katie's mother deserves to know what happened to her daughter. The search warrant was executed on a cold March morning in 2023. Michael was there, along with FBI agents and the local sheriff's department. Donald Vickers answered his door in pajamas, confused, aging, looking like someone's grandfather. Donald Vickers, I'm Detective Michael Torres. We have a warrant to search your property. What? Why? What's this about? It's about Katie Morrison. I think you remember her. Michael watched Vickers' face. Something flickered in his eyes. Fear, guilt, something. But Vickers said nothing, just stepped aside and let them in. The house was neat, spare. Photos of children on the mantel, his grandchildren probably. A recliner facing a television. A kitchen with dishes drying in the rack. It looked like the home of a lonely old man, not a monster. But monsters don't wear signs. Michael knew that. Sometimes they look like everyone's grandfather. The search took 6 hours. They found nothing obviously incriminating. No photos of Katie, no trophies from the crime, no evidence of other victims. But in the basement, in a toolbox, they found a pair of old Red Wing work boots, style 2406, worn but preserved. The right boot showed a wear pattern consistent with someone who walked with an outward cant. They confiscated the boots. They took DNA samples from Vickers, who submitted without resistance, but also without saying a word, having invoked his right to an attorney. Back at the lab, forensics compared the boots to the print from Katie's yard. It was a match, not definitively, because footprint analysis isn't as precise as fingerprints or DNA, but consistent. The wear pattern aligned. The size was right, but it still wasn't enough. The boots matched, but so would thousands of other boots. Vickers had been in the neighborhood, suspicious, but not proof. They needed DNA, needed something to place Katie in his truck or his home. Michael went back through every piece of evidence collected in 1987. And then he remembered something. In the initial search of the Morrison property, police had collected samples from the yard using tape lifts, looking for any trace evidence. Those samples had been stored, forgotten. Michael had them sent to the FBI lab with instructions. Look for any DNA that doesn't match the Morrison family. Modern DNA analysis can extract profiles from incredibly degraded samples, from sources that 1987 technology couldn't touch. The lab worked for 2 months. In May 2023, Michael got the call he'd been waiting for. They'd found DNA on one of the tape lifts from the Morrison yard, near where the partial boot print had been found. The DNA was from skin cells, probably from touch transfer. It was degraded, but enough remained to build a partial profile. The lab compared it against every available database, looking for a match. It matched Donald Vickers. Vickers' DNA was in Katie's front yard, in a location where he had no legitimate reason to be, on the day she disappeared. Michael sat down heavily, staring at the report. After 36 years, he had him. He had the man who'd taken Katie Morrison. But having him, and proving what happened to Katie, were different things. DNA in the yard proved presence, but not abduction. The DA wanted more before filing charges. They needed to pressure Vickers, needed to make him talk. Michael prepared meticulously. He reviewed everything he knew about Vickers' life, looking for leverage. The man had 3 children, all adults now. Michael interviewed them separately, carefully. The oldest daughter, Susan, was 50, living in Oregon. She described her father as distant, controlling, obsessed with appearing respectable. He always cared more about what neighbors thought than about us, she said. Everything was about maintaining the image of a perfect family. The son, Donald Jr., was 48, living in Illinois. He barely spoke to his father anymore. "We had a falling out years ago," he said. "I don't want to talk about him." "Even if it might help solve a child's disappearance?" Michael asked. Donald Jr. went quiet. Then, "What child?" Michael told him about Katie Morrison. Watched the man's face go pale. "Jesus," Donald Jr. whispered. "Jesus Christ. Did your father ever do anything that made you think he was capable of something like this?" Donald Jr. looked away. "When I was a kid, Dad would drive around neighborhoods, just circling, watching. He said he was looking at houses for work, but it always felt wrong. And he had photos of children, just random kids at parks, at playgrounds. He said he liked photography, but it felt creepy. My mom found them once and they had a huge fight. Do you know what happened to those photos? Mom made him burn them. That's what she told me anyway." The youngest child was a 44-year-old daughter, Marie, living in Duluth. She refused to talk about her father at all, but her body language spoke volumes, arms crossed, eyes down, fear and anger radiating from her. Michael interviewed Vickers' neighbors in Moose Lake. They described him as quiet, kept to himself, occasionally grumpy, but mostly harmless. But one neighbor, a woman named Beth Morrison, no relation to Katie's family, mentioned something odd. "Don used to watch the school bus stop," she said. "There's a stop right at the corner. He'd be out in his yard when the kids got off the bus. I always thought it was strange. Why would a man in his 70s need to be outside at 3:15 every day?" Michael felt pieces clicking into place. Not enough for certain conviction, but enough to approach Vickers again, this time with his attorney present, and make an offer. The interview took place in June 2023 at the Ashland County Sheriff's Department. Michael sat across from Donald Vickers and his attorney, a young public defender who looked overwhelmed. "Mr. Vickers, we have your DNA in Katie Morrison's yard on the day she disappeared," Michael began. "We have witnesses who saw your truck in the neighborhood repeatedly before her disappearance. We have evidence you were watching children. We have your juvenile record for voyeurism. We have your ex-wife's statement about your concerning behavior around kids." Vickers stared at his hands. He'd aged in the months since the search, looked smaller, grayer, diminished. "We know you took Katie," Michael continued, keeping his voice steady, though his heart was pounding. "We know you were on that roof, watching her, waiting for a chance. We know you came down, approached her while her mother was inside. What we don't know is what happened after that. Where is Katie, Donald? Her mother has been waiting 36 years to know. You can give her that closure. It might even help you at sentencing." Vickers' attorney whispered something to him. Vickers shook his head. "My children," Vickers said, his voice cracking. "What will they think?" "I think they already know," Michael said gently. "I think on some level, they've always known. This is your chance to finally tell the truth, to give Katie's family peace." Silence stretched out. Then Vickers started crying, ugly, rasping sobs that shook his thin frame. "I didn't mean to kill her," he whispered. Michael felt time stop. The attorney's pen froze on his legal pad. The recording device captured every word. "Tell me what happened, Donald." And he did. Imperfect healing. Donald Vickers had been watching the Morrison house for weeks, he confessed. He'd noticed Lynn's routine, grocery shopping Friday afternoons, always coming home around the same time. He'd noticed Katie, blonde and beautiful and trusting, playing in the yard. He hadn't planned to take her. That's what he claimed, though Michael didn't believe him. Men don't circle neighborhoods for weeks without planning. But he'd been on the Henderson roof that day, and he'd seen Katie playing alone, and Lynn going inside, and the opportunity had been too perfect. He'd climbed down from the roof, telling the Hendersons he needed to get a tool from his truck. Instead, he'd walked 2 houses down. Katie had been right there, holding a melting popsicle, watching ants on the sidewalk. "I told her I'd seen a butterfly in my truck," Vickers said, tears streaming down his face. "She came with me. She trusted me. I put her in the cab and drove away. The whole thing took maybe 2 minutes. He'd driven to his house on the edge of town, planning to..." He didn't finish that sentence, couldn't say out loud what he'd intended. But Katie had started crying in the truck, calling for her mommy, and Vickers had panicked. "I just wanted her to be quiet," he said. "I put my hand over her mouth, and she struggled, and I pressed harder. I didn't realize. I didn't mean to." Katie had suffocated. Accidentally, Vickers claimed, though the distinction mattered little. He'd killed a 3-year-old child because she'd cried for her mother. "What did you do with her body?" Michael asked, his voice steady, though rage was burning in his chest. Vickers took them to a location outside Ashland, a wooded area near an abandoned quarry. In July 2023, 36 years after Katie disappeared, a forensic team began excavating. They found her 2 days later. Small bones, carefully wrapped in plastic, buried 3 feet down. A tattered piece of pink fabric that had once been shorts. Small white sandals, preserved by the plastic. And a chain around the neck bones. A small silver necklace with a butterfly charm that Lynn had given Katie for her 3rd birthday. Michael called Lynn Morrison himself. She was 71 now, still living in Ashland with David, who was 73 and in declining health. Their daughter Rebecca was with them when Michael arrived. "We found Katie," he said, and Lynn made a sound that wasn't quite human. Grief and relief and horror all mixed together. "Is she?" Lynn couldn't finish. "She's deceased. I'm so sorry. She's been deceased since the day she disappeared." Lynn nodded, as if she'd always known but had needed to hear it confirmed. "Did she suffer?" Michael had promised himself he'd be honest. "It was quick. He says she didn't suffer long." "Who?" David asked, his voice rough. "Who was it?" "Donald Vickers, the contractor who was working on the Hendersons' roof that day." Lynn's face went blank. Donnie? Donnie Vickers? But he helped look for her. He hugged me. He told me he was praying for us. I know. He was at our house. He drank coffee in our kitchen. He looked at Katie's photos and cried. Lynn's voice was rising, horror and betrayal mixing with grief. He stood in my daughter's bedroom and pretended to care. Rebecca held her mother as she broke, and Michael wanted to leave, wanted to give them privacy. But he knew they needed answers more than they needed privacy. Why? Lynn finally asked. Why would he do this? I don't know if there's an answer that will make sense, Michael said honestly. He had a problem, a sickness. He was sexually attracted to children. He saw Katie and he wanted. Michael stopped, shook his head. He took her, and when she cried, he panicked and killed her. Then he hid her body and pretended to help search. He watched us suffer, David said, his voice hollow. For 36 years he knew, and he watched us suffer. There was nothing Michael could say to that, no comfort he could offer. So he just sat with them, bearing witness to their pain, until they were ready for him to leave. The news broke nationally. Missing child cases that remain unsolved for decades always capture attention, and when they're finally resolved, the media coverage is intense. Katie's photo was on every news channel, that same picture from her birthday party, forever 3 years old with frosting on her nose. Donald Vickers was charged with first-degree intentional homicide, kidnapping, and concealing a corpse. Despite his confession, his attorney tried to argue diminished capacity, that Vickers hadn't meant to kill Katie, that it had been a tragic accident. The prosecutor, a fierce woman named Maria Santos, argued that the moment Vickers lured Katie to his truck, he'd sealed her fate. This was no accident, Santos told the jury. This was a predator who stalked a child, who waited for his opportunity, who took her knowing what he intended to do. That she died during the commission of that crime doesn't make it less intentional. Donald Vickers stole Katie Morrison's entire life, her 4th birthday, her first day of school, her graduation, her wedding, her children. He stole decades from her family, forcing them to live in torment while he went about his life. This was intentional, calculated, and deserving of the maximum penalty. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Michael testified about the investigation, walking the jury through 36 years of dead ends, and finally, the breakthrough. He showed them photos of the Morrison family from 1987, young, vibrant, whole, and then recent photos showing what grief had carved into their faces over decades. Forensic experts testified about the DNA evidence, explaining in careful detail how skin cells can survive for decades, how technology had evolved to the point where they could extract meaning from microscopic traces. They showed the jury photos of Katie's remains, and several jurors wept. The ex-wife testified about Vickers' disturbing behavior around children. She was in her 70s now, still carrying guilt that she'd seen the warning signs, but hadn't known what to do with them. I should have reported him, she said from the stand, crying. I should have done something. Maybe Katie would still be alive if I'd been braver. Santos was gentle with her. You couldn't have known what he would do. The only person responsible for Katie's death is the man who killed her. His son, Donald Jr., testified about the photos, voice shaking with shame and anger. He'd brought one with him, saved all these years, one his mother had missed when she made Vickers burn the rest. It showed children at a playground, taken with a telephoto lens from a distance, focusing on little girls in summer clothes. Donald Jr. had kept it as evidence of what his father was, though he'd never known what to do with that knowledge until now. I knew my father was sick, he told the jury. I knew he watched children in ways that weren't normal, but I didn't know. I couldn't imagine. His voice broke completely. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't do something sooner. Maybe if I'd told someone. Maybe Katie. The judge called a recess. Donald Jr. sat in the hallway afterwards, head in his hands, while Rebecca Morrison approached him. Michael watched nervously, unsure what she would say. It's not your fault, Rebecca told him quietly. You were a child when he took my sister. You didn't know. This is on him, not you. Donald Jr. looked up at her, tears streaming down his face. How can you be kind to me? My father killed your sister. Your father killed my sister, Rebecca agreed. You didn't, and you're here now, testifying against him. That takes courage. That matters. They stood there together, two people bound by Donald Vickers' crime, both victims in different ways, offering each other the grace that Vickers had never shown anyone. Lynn Morrison testified. She was calm, almost eerily so, as she described Katie, her laughter, her love of butterflies, her bedtime routines. Then Santos asked her to describe the last time she saw her daughter alive. She was eating a cherry popsicle, Lynn said, her voice finally breaking. It was melting faster than she could eat it. Her whole face was sticky and red, and she was laughing because I was making a fuss about cleaning her up. She said, It's okay, Mommy. I'm just very messy today. Those were the last words I heard my daughter say. I'm just very messy today. And I told her. Lynn's voice cracked completely. I told her to go play while I put away groceries. If I'd just brought her inside with me, if I'd cleaned her up first, if I'd been watching. Mrs. Morrison, Santos said gently, whose fault is it that Katie died? Lynn looked straight at Donald Vickers, who sat hunched at the defense table, not meeting anyone's eyes. His. It's his fault, only his. Rebecca testified about growing up in the shadow of her missing sister, about the therapy, the guilt, the way the whole family had frozen in place on August 14, 1987, and never fully thawed. The defense tried to paint Vickers as a mentally ill man who needed treatment, not punishment. A psychiatrist testified that Vickers had pedophilic disorder, that he'd struggled with these urges his whole life, but had mostly controlled them, that taking Katie had been an impulsive act he immediately regretted. That's why he killed her, Santos said in her closing argument, because he immediately regretted luring her away. His regret manifested as murder. He put his hand over a 3-year-old's mouth and nose and held it there until she stopped breathing. Then he wrapped her in plastic like trash and buried her, and went home to his wife. That's not mental illness. That's evil. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found Donald Vickers guilty on all counts. At sentencing, Lynn read a victim impact statement. She was 72 now, white-haired, dignified in her grief. She spoke not about hatred, though she had every right to, but about loss. Katie would have been 39 years old, she said. She might have been married, might have had children. I might have been a grandmother. Rebecca might have had a sister to share life with. David might have gotten to walk another daughter down the aisle. We'll never know what Katie might have become, what she might have given to the world. She turned to look at Vickers directly. You didn't just kill Katie. You killed every version of her that might have existed. You killed the joy in our family. You killed my ability to trust, my ability to feel safe. You killed the close relationship David and I once had. We survived our marriage, but we didn't thrive in it, not after Katie. You killed Rebecca's childhood, her sense of security. You killed so much more than one small girl. Then she said something that made Michael's throat tight. "But you didn't kill everything. You didn't kill my love for Katie. You didn't kill my memories of her laughter. You didn't kill the fact that she existed, that she mattered, that she brought light to the world for 3 years. You tried to erase her, but we kept her alive. Every year on her birthday, we light candles. Every August 14th, we remember. Every time I see a butterfly, I think of her. You buried her body, but you couldn't bury her." The judge sentenced Donald Vickers to life in prison without possibility of parole. He would die in custody. He was 74, in poor health, unlikely to survive more than a few years. It wasn't enough. No sentence could be enough. But it was something. Katie's remains were returned to the family. They held a funeral service 36 years after her death, and the whole town of Ashland turned out. People who remembered Katie, people who'd been children themselves when she disappeared, people who'd followed the case for decades. They all came to finally say goodbye. Katie was buried in Lakeview Cemetery, next to her grandmother, under a headstone that read, "Katie Grace Morrison, February 12, 1984, August 14, 1987, beloved daughter and sister, forever our butterfly." Lynn planted monarch butterfly bushes at the gravesite. Every summer, butterflies visit. Living after Michael Torres flew back to Madison after the sentencing, emotionally exhausted. Elena picked him up from the airport, took one look at his face, and just held him. "How are they?" she asked, meaning the Morrison family. "Broken, but maybe starting to heal. I don't know." Michael couldn't stop thinking about Lynn's statement in court, about how she'd kept Katie alive through memory and love. He thought about Sophia, healthy and vibrant, studying marine life and dating a nice boy, and living the full, complex, beautiful life that Katie never got to have. He couldn't bring Katie back, but he'd given her family the truth, and sometimes that was all anyone could do. Lynn Morrison lived for 5 more years after the trial. She died peacefully in 2028, at 77, with David and Rebecca beside her. In her final days, she spoke often about Katie, smiling at memories that used to make her cry. "I can let go now," she told Rebecca. "I know where she is. I know what happened. I can let go." David followed 18 months later. At his funeral, Rebecca spoke about how her parents had loved each other through unimaginable grief, how they'd survived what breaks most couples, how their love for Katie had kept them connected even when pain drove them apart. Rebecca still lives in Ashland. She's married, has 2 daughters of her own. The older one is named Katie, which was hard at first, but eventually felt right. She works with families of missing children, helping them navigate the legal system, the media attention, the endless waiting. "I can't give them their children back," she says, "but I can walk beside them. I can tell them that survival is possible, even if it doesn't feel like it now." Donald Vickers died in prison in 2026, 3 years into his sentence, of a heart attack. There were no mourners at his funeral besides one of his daughters, who came out of obligation and left in tears, not for him, but for everyone he'd hurt. Michael Torres still works cold cases. Katie's case changed him, deepened his commitment. He's solved 4 more since then, bringing answers to families who'd waited decades. Each one takes a piece of him, but Elena reminds him he's also giving something. Truth, closure, the knowledge that someone cared enough to keep looking. He keeps a photo on his desk, not of Katie, though he thinks about her often, but of Sophia, vibrant and alive at 23. It reminds him why he does this work, why it matters to give families answers, even when those answers bring pain. The Morrison house on Maple Street has new owners now, a young couple with a baby. They know the history. Everyone in Ashland knows the history, but they painted the house blue and planted new flowers and filled it with laughter. Life goes on, as it must. Sometimes, on summer mornings, monarch butterflies visit the garden. The new owners think it's beautiful, this yearly migration of butterflies. They don't know that the previous residents, that Lynn Morrison, always believed those butterflies were Katie coming to visit, making sure everyone was okay. Maybe it's fanciful, this idea that a little girl's spirit comes back as butterflies. Maybe it's just grief seeking comfort in coincidence. But maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe what matters is that Katie was loved, is still loved, will always be loved. Katie Grace Morrison was 3 years old when she died. She should have gotten to grow up, should have gotten her chance at life. Donald Vickers stole that from her, and no trial, no sentence, no justice can return it. But Katie's story didn't end when Vickers buried her body in the woods. She lived on in her mother's memory, in her sister's advocacy work, in the detective who wouldn't let her be forgotten. She lives on in every parent who holds their child a little tighter, every neighbor who watches out for the kids on their street, every person who decides to care about children who aren't their own. The criminal justice system likes clean endings. Guilty, not guilty, sentenced, case closed. But real life isn't that tidy. The Morrison family got answers, but the ache of Katie's absence never fully left. They learned to live around it, the way you learn to walk with a limp after an injury. It changes you forever, but you do keep walking. Rebecca visits Katie's grave every August 14th, bringing fresh flowers and sitting for a while in silence. Sometimes other people are there too, friends from that daycare program Katie briefly attended, neighbors who still remember, people who followed the case and needed to pay their respects now that Katie could finally rest. I used to think that if we just found out what happened, everything would be okay, Rebecca told Michael at one of these anniversary visits. But that's not how it works, is it? Knowing doesn't undo the loss. It doesn't give me back my sister, doesn't give Mom and Dad back those years they spent in agony. It just ends one kind of pain and begins another. But it's different pain, Michael offered. It's the pain of grief instead of the pain of uncertainty. Yeah, Rebecca agreed. And you can grieve something you can name. You can't grieve a question mark. They stood together at Katie's grave, reading the inscription, watching butterflies dance above the flowers. Somewhere in the distance, children were playing, their laughter carried on the summer breeze. Life continuing. Childhood, still precious and still vulnerable, still requiring protection from the Donald Vickers of the world. Thank you, Rebecca said finally, for not forgetting her, for caring enough to look. I think about her every day, Michael admitted, about who she might have become, what the world lost when she died. She would have been kind, Rebecca said with certainty. Whatever else, she would have been kind. She was generous with her joy, even at 3. She would have been someone special. Michael nodded. He'd learned, over years of this work, that there was no such thing as closure. Not really. Just degrees of knowing, levels of understanding. The best you could hope for was to move from unbearable uncertainty to bearable grief. The Morrisons had made that journey. It had taken 36 years, but they'd made it. In 2029, Ashland erected a small memorial in the park near where Katie used to play. A bench with a plaque that reads, "In memory of Katie Grace Morrison and all children taken too soon. May we create a world where every child is safe, valued, and free to chase butterflies." On sunny days, mothers sit on that bench watching their children play, And maybe they hold their kids a little closer, watch a little more carefully. Katie's death mattered because it reminded people of how precious and fragile childhood is, how vigilant we must be. This is Katie's legacy, not the crime committed against her, but the love that refused to forget her. Not the 3 years she lived, but the decades she's been remembered. Not what was stolen from her, but what remains. A family's devotion, a detective's commitment, a community's care. Donald Vickers took Katie's life, but he couldn't take her significance. He couldn't take the fact that she mattered, that she was loved, that her absence left a hole in the world that no one could fill. In the end, that's what remains when we strip away all the legal proceedings and forensic evidence and newspaper headlines. A little girl who loved butterflies, who laughed with frosting on her nose, who trusted too easily and died too young. A girl who deserved so much more than she got, who lives on not in the life she was denied, but in the memories of those who loved her. Katie Grace Morrison, born February 12, 1984, taken August 14, 1987, found July 2023, forever 3 years old, forever their butterfly, forever missed, forever loved.